Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Venezuela. Protests, price rises, shortages and soaring crime. Can the country with 3 different exchange rates get its economic house in order and avoid a political collapse? Also this week, the land of the rising debt. Japan's consumers are paying the price. But what chance of making any real progress up that mountain of debt as Japan's population ages? And Ireland's property boom. Just as the government loosens its dependence on the bailout, we look at how repossessions and overseas speculators could drive the economy back over the edge. It might sound a little simplistic, but we're seeing more and more these days that when people are unhappy with their lives, they protest. Just recently, think of Thailand, Ukraine, and you can add Venezuela to that list, which is our focus this week. 2 months ago, people began protesting about soaring inflation and shortages of basic goods. They say they'll stay on the streets until the socialist president Nicolas Maduro resigns. But truth be told, Venezuela's problems started long before Maduro came to power. It was the late Hugo Chavez who had the idea of providing financial support to Venezuela's poorest, which was laudable, but it relied on oil money and actually resulted in less money being invested in the oil sector, which meant less oil production, which meant lower returns, which meant, I think you start to get the idea. And there's a whole lot of other problems as well. A decade of currency controls have pushed inflation up as high as 56% last year. And the country's scarcity index, that was up at 28%. That means around 1 in 4 products which are tracked by that index were not available for people to readily buy. Venezuela also devalued its currency, the bolivar, by about 90%. And what's truly extraordinary is that despite $120 billion in oil revenue a year, Venezuela is actually expecting another year of recession. Put all that together, and there are clearly some problems. And it's interesting also to see how far-reaching those effects can be. Our Latin America editor Lucia Newman's reporting for us this week. She has this on the relationship between a deteriorating economic climate and crime.
It's lunchtime, and bodyguard Larry Ruiz paces up and down outside a posh Caracas restaurant, waiting for his wealthy client. The street is usually full of armored cars and bodyguards, a sign of the times.
Before, there were areas that were more secure. Now nowhere is safe.
Not even for him. Ruiz explains that killing bodyguards and taking their weapons has become a status symbol for criminals. I'm invited to follow his client's heavily armored car. His job, he says, is to confront the criminals while the would-be kidnap victim escapes.
We repelled an attack recently, but just barely, because they're better armed than us. The government only allows us to carry 25 rounds.
In poor neighborhoods of Caracas, it's even more dangerous. On this Sunday, we find residents drinking beer and betting on horse races. But as Omaira, the owner of the kiosk, explains, it's not so much fun when the sun goes down.
We hear the gunfire. We hear that a person has been killed on one corner or another. It happens all the time.
Rich or poor, all Venezuelans have had to adjust to living in one of the world's most dangerous countries, where the murder rate has tripled in the last 15 years.
Even the pure escapism of going to the movies can sometimes prove to be no escape at all. On at least 2 occasions, entire audiences have been held up at gunpoint by criminals who locked the doors and forced everyone to empty their pockets.
But leaving the cinema is also a risk. This former policeman says he managed to fight off the criminals who tried to kidnap him here in the cinema's car park.
When the main assailant ran off, I realized I was wounded, that the bullet had gone in through here and out through here. They caught him, but he was released without bail because the judge said it wasn't a life-threatening wound.
Indeed, some experts are convinced that it's not poverty, but a weakened system of law and order which is fueling crime.
So in Venezuela, what you have is you have a lot of money in the streets, and you have a very dysfunctional security apparatus, very dysfunctional police force, very dysfunctional judicial system and penal system.
And so, 90% of crimes go unpunished in this country where most lawbreakers remain free, while the rest seek refuge behind bars.
Lucia Newman reporting there. She also sat down with an economics expert, Alejandro Grisanti, who is the director for Latin America at Barclays Bank, To get more of an idea about the source of all these problems, she began by querying whether Venezuela's economy was actually going downhill faster than ever.
Yes, that's the case, and I believe that the principal problem was the fiscal account. The government has maintained for more than 5 years double-digit fiscal deficit. I mean, deficit higher than 10%, okay? And the thing that they were doing in the last 2 years was to monetize the deficit. Basically, to print money, to put the central bank to print money, transfer this money to PDVSA, and they spend over the economy. And basically, the thing that we are having right now is more bolivars, okay, following the same goods, the same production that Venezuela has.
What about the government's latest efforts to try to control the black market rate of the dollar?
I think that was a step in the right direction. Okay, all capital controls are bad. All capital controls produce distortion. But if the capital control is more rigid, okay, if the government tries to exercise a higher control, it's even worse. So the thing that the government is doing is to make more flexible the exchange rate system, to give access every day to the private sector, as you mentioned, at a much, much weaker rate, but to give more access of dollars to the private sector. And this will help to solve some of the problems of scarcity on the non-priority goods that Venezuela is suffering.
So Venezuela now has 3 different exchange rates, and only one of them is a floating exchange rate, isn't that right?
Let's first define what is an equilibrium exchange rate for the Venezuelan economy, okay? The equilibrium exchange rate in our models basically indicates that the equilibrium exchange rate could be something near 20 bolivars per dollar. So the 6.3 that the government have for a priority good, foods and medicine, is a clearly distortion because have a level of overvaluation of that rate. I mean, basically in that front, for that sector, the bolivar is stronger of what the economy is demanding. Exactly the same happened to the 11.3, 11, around 11 that is the CAT 1. But the other rate that is 52 still have very significant amount of undervaluation. So we have here oil companies, private oil companies that receive dollars, okay, and that they need to spend bolivars. I think that they will participate in this market. I think that we have different contractors, people who make to give some service to the government that also receive the payment of their infrastructure project that they are doing in dollars, and they need to pay bolivars. I think that also will be a very good opportunity for these 2 types of companies to participate in this market.
The Venezuela's government insists that this astronomical inflation rate and all these shortages are really caused by a U.S. and private sector campaign to destabilize the state. Is that possible?
I mean, it's not possible that the whole private sector is committing suicide, no? That they are killing themselves, that they don't want to sell the product that they have. I mean, for me, it's very clear, and this is something that worries me because the government is not giving the signals that the SICAP could be a change in direction. Okay, we have in Venezuela, after 15 years, the country with the highest inflation among all the emerging markets. We have the country with the lowest growth. If we compare the growth in Venezuela with the rest of Latin America, we grow almost half of what Latin American growth in the last 15 years. If we compare Venezuela, that is part of the OPEC country, with the growth of the rest of the OPEC country, including Iraq, including Libya, Venezuela grows 1/3 of what the rest of the OPEC country was growing. So for me, it's clearly a mismanagement of the economic policy, and the government is not looking that. And until now, that's something that worries me, is that they have not given signals of change. After 15 years of very negative results, we have the same economic team, the same minister of oil, the same president of the central bank. We have the same team managing the economy after all the mistakes that they were doing.
Is there any quick-term solution?
I think that the government will need to adjust. I mean, it is not possible that government spend much more of what they receive in income. Okay, they could devalue the currency and increase the income. They could increase the domestic price of the gasoline. They can try to raise taxes, okay, the non-oil taxes, but all of them and try to control the spending. But the thing that we are talking here is a very strong level of adjustment. The government, according to our calculation, the government spent, the fiscal deficit reached 16% of the GDP last year. 16% of the GDP. So the level of the adjustment that Venezuela need to do is almost 16% of the GDP, okay, looking to rise income and to reduce spending. And this is something, of course, that the Venezuelan will suffer. Right now, the big question is how in this political situation, con people protesting on the street, okay, con people looking for improvement in the real life, in the welfare, how the government will implement this adjustment.
It's not a good time for belt tightening.
I don't think so. I don't think so, and this is the principal problem that Venezuela and the Venezuelans are suffering. I basically believe that the time will get worse before it starts to become better.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we're in Ireland, which is apparently experiencing a property boom. But what does it count for when homelessness and repossessions are soaring too? Right now, though, we're taking you to Japan, land of the rising sun and rising debt too, it seems. How do you combat that? Well, you raise sales taxes from 5 to 8%, which actually isn't much if you consider sales tax in some nations is up in the double digits. But it's the psychological damage they do, which could hurt Japanese growth. Then again, this is pretty damaging too. For a bit of context, every man, woman and child in Japan owes the equivalent of almost $100,000. Japan's debt is at almost 245% of GDP. Second on the list of most debted nations is Ireland, where each resident owes slightly more than $60,000. And third, the United States, where the figure is slightly less than that $60,000. And compounding Japan's position at the top of that unenviable list is the fact that its population is aging. That makes the whole situation a lot more urgent. Harry Fawcett has our report now from Tokyo.
HIDEKAZU Kobayashi's tofu shop has been in his family for generations. He and his staff have honed the art of making this inexpensive staple food. But like small business owners across the country, he's worried about the impact of a rise in Japan's sales tax from 5 to 8%.
Tofu is something you eat every day. That means you have to pay tax each time. I think it's going to weigh heavily on my customers.
At just 5%, Japan's sales tax has been seen by economists as out of kilter with tackling a national debt that stands at more than twice the size of the economy.
This country has so much debt, and it's something that our generation has to face, and our children and grandchildren.
It can't be helped. It's partly because our government didn't do well up until this point. I hope they don't waste the money.
Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has made economic recovery the priority of his administration through his so-called Abenomics, a mixture of stimulus, deregulation and reform. The government has made a show of persuading big companies to raise salaries and has announced an additional $50 billion stimulus in the hope that any shock to the economy caused by the tax hike will be short-lived.
We should see a negative GDP growth in the April-June quarter this year. Nevertheless, we are believing that the economy should pick up in the July-September quarter.
Much of this is about demography. Japan's starting to confront the rising costs of its aging society. But still, this move is a tentative one. This is very much a first step in putting Japan's financial house in order. A second rise, taking the tax to 10%, is currently slated for October next year. And many economists say it would have to go up to 15, even 20% if it's really going to tackle Japan's public debt. The weeks leading up to the rise have seen an upsurge in spending as consumers rush to beat the deadline day. Now businesses, big and small, are bracing for a downturn and hoping it's brief.
Now, just months after the Irish government claimed to be on the road to recovery, it looks like foreign speculators are creating a new property bubble. Worse yet, housing campaigners say that's leading to a trend of working families having their homes repossessed. Is Ireland about to repeat the mistakes that led to the financial crash of the Celtic Tiger? Laurence has our report from Dublin.
In the contradictory world of the Eurozone, a country can claim to be recovering while many of its people get poorer. Witness Dublin, where there's a mini housing boom, while getting on for 200,000 people have no way of paying their mortgage. Gillian felt the full perverse effects of this when she went bankrupt and lost her home. She says the effects hit her like a truck.
I really, really understand what it's like to feel no hope, because during those 6 months I was a death zombie. I was barely functioning. I could hardly put one foot in front of the other, and it was horrendous place to be.
Foreign capital seems to be behind the new boom, but it's locals who lose out. The banks have little reason to repossess a home in a depressed market, but when prices rise, people become vulnerable. Peter McVerry was granted the freedom of the city of Dublin a few days ago for his tireless work with the homeless, and he's witnessed this new phenomenon firsthand.
The majority of people today who are becoming homeless are ordinary working class and even middle class people who simply can no longer afford to pay for accommodation.
And while the new homeless have nowhere to go, huge numbers of these half-built homes, where construction stopped when the last property bubble popped, sit as reminders of a previous nightmare. So there's this most extraordinary situation now that's developed in Ireland, where the government says there's not enough housing for property speculators and foreign investors. Homeless campaigners are saying there's a desperate lack of affordable housing for the dispossessed and the poor, and yet there are thousands and thousands of empty, unoccupied homes like this all over Ireland, which apparently nobody wants. Never again, the Irish government has said over and over, will it repeat the mistakes of the past which destroyed so much. So is that no longer true?
We do not and never will again get to a situation where it's the property owners and the developers who lead in terms of where we build houses. It will be about the community, not about the developers.
In the contradictory world of the Eurozone, recapitalised banks can refuse to lend to Irish citizens, while foreign speculators inflate the housing market and leave properties unaffordable. The question is whether the government can stop all this from happening all over again.
You might remember last week on Counting the Cost we looked at climate change. Well, we're going to do that again this week. Europe's got some plans to help combat it from space, and we'll look at that shortly. But first, the pointy end, back here on Earth. BHOLA Island in the south of Bangladesh is often called the ground zero of climate change. Rising seas, river erosion, half of the island's disappeared in the past 40 years, which creates so-called climate refugees. Mahar Sattar has some of their stories.
Mohammed RIPON never thought it would happen to him. For years, he watched as the rampaging river swallowed up the homes of his fellow residents on BHOLA Island. But he always thought he and his family would be safe.
Even a year ago, you couldn't see the river from here. It was miles away, and the government was building barriers to stop erosion. But the waters broke through anyway.
This used to be the room where his family would eat. Now they're forced to eat in the open. Mohammed RIPON was born in this house. He spent his whole life here. Now he has to find a new place to stay. It's a process many locals on the island have gone through 8, 9, even 10 times. This all used to be a garden belonging to Mohammed RIPON's family. The locals here say that just 10 years ago, it used to take 2 whole days to walk from here to the riverbank. Stretching out from here, there used to be a dozen villages. Today, they're all gone. According to experts, climate change is to blame for BHOLA's disappearing act. The island faces twin threats: rising sea levels and a river that crashes down on its shores harder than ever thanks to erratic rains.
For the flight of these BHOLA Island people, it is the developed countries are responsible. So the developed countries, the highest carbon emitters, have to take the responsibility of these climate migrants.
The Bangladesh government has built villages to house the displaced, but there aren't enough of them.
The demand for these houses is much more than the supply. There's so many people who've lost their homes, the demand is too much.
Even some of these villages have already been lost to the encroaching waters. So far, 500,000 residents of BHOLA have been displaced. The rest fear it won't be long before they share the same fate.
So that's the very real problem, but what's being done to further our knowledge of climate change is quite fascinating. The European Space Agency is in on the act now, launching its Sentinel-1A satellite from French Guiana, part of a $10 billion constellation of Earth observation satellites, just the first of many to be sent into space as part of the Copernicus program. It's hoped all the satellite technology will give scientists a better understanding of our environment and what's actually affecting it. Let's get more with Joseph Aschbacher, who is the head of the Copernicus space program at the European Space Agency. He is in French Guiana for us. Joseph, let me give you my viewpoint first of all, as someone who loves space exploration, but I have to say I think that a lot of the time it's billions of dollars which could be much better spent on Earth. However, it seems like you've struck a happy medium here. You're spending money on a space program and it has direct relevance to Earth.
Absolutely, and this is exactly what is one of our sales arguments, if I may say, when we ask for money. Indeed, it is true once we define a satellite program and with all the elements that are associated to it, it costs a significant amount of money. However, we have been doing independent studies, or we have been asking independent consultants to study the socioeconomic impact of the investments made in Copernicus. And these studies, several of them independently, have shown that on average, if you invest €1 into the Copernicus program, you get 10 euros back in terms of socioeconomic benefit. An investment of 1 to 10, as you might agree, is a good investment. And this comes through better information, which is given to decision makers, but also to the people, in order to make better decisions, to save money, to save lives, and really gain also economically, not only having better knowledge of our planet Earth.
Are we talking about quick response sort of stuff? Because, you know, you put a satellite into orbit and it can send information back and you get a good long-term picture about what's happening with the environment. But you use the phrase save lives in that last answer, and I'm wondering, you know, if there's another Typhoon Haiyan or a superstorm Sandy or these sorts of things, can you get quick information out to first responders so that they can use it immediately and save lives?
It is, okay, we have different satellites which are being launched. The first one tonight, which is a radar satellite, which has the huge advantage of looking through clouds, rain layers, but also getting images at night. So whenever the satellite flies over the area, you can get the image. This is very important to start with. Then we have built up an information or data access, data dissemination scheme, which is catering to the user needs. Right. For example, some users don't need the data quickly. If you are mapping forest areas, or if you are predicting agricultural crops, crop evolution or yield productions, then you need the data within a few days. But in some cases, you need the data very quickly when it comes to disasters or when life is at risk. And there we have, for those emergency services or those services where information is needed quickly, we have set up special chains where the data can be downloaded after the satellite flies over in a shorter time. And take the example of oil spill monitoring, where we have such a chain put in place where all the oil spills in European waters are being monitored. And there we get the image 10 minutes after the overflight of the satellite to the user community, which then informs the Coast Guard in order to take action. So this is really, I would say, the fastest time which is possible, but it is certainly a huge improvement of what is done routinely in many of the other Earth observation satellite services.
Okay, Joseph, I'll admit you've sold me on the idea. And you've talked about good economic returns as well. I think you said 10 euros for every one invested, so that's good. But there's no escaping that there are still a lot of economic problems in Europe. Was it tough to get the funding, to go to the governments and seek out money for space exploration at these tough times?
Yes, indeed, you can imagine, and you say it exactly rightly. There is economic difficulties, and there has been a real crisis in Europe just a few years ago, and we have been at the same time asking for the next funding phase. And indeed, it has been very tough to convince decision makers to invest into this activity. But with the arguments I mentioned, that you are also developing an economy, and this is investment into the economy and into the people at large. This has been convincing. But also, it is information which is provided that helps saving lives and helping people understanding also better the state of the climate, which of course is also in the long term a very life-threatening issue for many people on this globe.
Well, Joseph Aschbacher from the ESA, good luck with this program. We do thank you very much for your time indeed today.
Thank you very much. The pleasure was all mine.
And there you go, that is our show for this week, but there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com. You can click through to the program's link, and from there you'll find the Counting the Cost page with all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. Also, to get in touch, you can tweet me at KamalAJE. There's also our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. And don't forget to use the hashtag, you've seen it on screen, counting the cost is the hashtag, or just drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.